much. This is a new experience for me. I've never been at a municipal committee meeting before, so if I go in the wrong direction, you can straighten me out. But I was pleased some time ago. Actually, I think I'm here because Kim Murray was asked to be here. And Kim has been elevated to a new position as an Assistant Deputy Attorney General in the Government of Ontario. So I know she was a member of this committee for a period of time and was an outstanding leader within the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So I was very humbled by the fact that Kim asked me to do this. I actually argued with her a little bit at the outset, saying maybe there's somebody who's more appropriate and better. And she said, no, you know all about it. You're the staff person to go and do this. And I saw Kim a couple of nights ago at the final wind-up of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Ottawa. So she gave me a couple of words of advice, which I will try and follow this morning. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and in particular about the work of reconciliation as it affects not just municipalities generally, but the City of Toronto, because that's where I live. This has been my home for many years, and I believe that Toronto has a pretty key role to play in what happens over the next several years. And the timing of this couldn't be better. I said to May a few weeks ago, I said, you know, May, a couple of days before this meeting, we're going to have the final, we've had about 3 or 4 final events for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but this will be it. We're going to table all the documents, some 2.5 million words and 6 volumes of all the material that's been assembled over the last half dozen years. And the commissioners will make a statement, and we'll look again at the 94 recommendations, take action items that were tabled in early June in Ottawa, and see where we go from there. But the one thing I don't think anybody could have anticipated, I mean, when did the invitation come? A couple months ago or so? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, we were in the middle of federal election at that time, as some people may remember. And, you know, it wasn't all that clear what the outcome was going to be, as elections sometimes happen. And then, of course, on election night, the Liberals won a very significant majority. And that in itself, I suppose, said something. You know, after a decade, there's going to be a new government in office. And interestingly enough, in June, when the sort of summary of the report was tabled, the leaders of the opposition, Tom Mulcair and Justin Trudeau, made it very clear that in terms of the 94 take action items, they would move on those if they were in government after the federal election, which was forecast to take place in October. They would move and implement them, and without many qualifications. The incumbent government at the time, the Conservative government, said, well, I want to study that. I wasn't sure just what it would do. So it was pretty clear that if there was a change of government, we would expect some fairly significant changes in the response that might take place to the work that the TRC had done. But I don't think anybody, and I include myself in that group, and I have, as some of you may know, I've spent most of my life in national and international politics. I did not anticipate the depth and the immediacy of this current government to indicate its seriousness about this. And if you have any interest in reading the 2 statements that Prime Minister Trudeau made on 2 previous Tuesdays, this past Tuesday to the TRC itself, and the previous Tuesday to the semi-annual meeting of the Assembly of First Nation in Gatineau. I have the statements with me. I'm not going to refer to them specifically this morning, but I just want to say that if you remember nothing else from my presentation here today, I hope you remember this, that what has happened, not just in the change of government, but what has happened in the actions and the words of the new Prime Minister is without precedent. I'll give you a couple of examples. In 1998, I was asked by the United Church of Canada, United Church ministry, which sometimes surprises some people, but I still have. Actually, I've gone straight now. I'm actually working at a church in Leaside.
Oh, thank you.
Shocking, isn't it? But in 1998, the United Church of Canada contacted me, the moderator and general secretary, to say I had to help them because they were in danger of going bankrupt. Now, I have to tell you, even after 17 years, this sort of boggles the mind that a national church, whether it was the Anglican Church or the United Church or Roman Catholic Church going bankrupt, didn't seem like, something essential. What it did say, though, I said that the legal situation, the lawsuits, the thousands of lawsuits that had poured in the late 90s from survivors on what had happened to them in 135 different residential schools across the country was so serious and so huge that the financial implications of that were in the hundreds of millions of dollars. It turns out a lot more than hundreds of millions, more in the billions of dollars. But as the old saying goes, it got everybody's attention. It certainly got my attention, but I knew a little bit more about it. And in the 17 years, I've done something that I thought would be helpful just to get a clear understanding of what we had to do in the longer term. I started going to regular meetings of the Assembly of First Nations. They meet twice a year. They have a big national meeting anywhere in the country in the summer, and then a semi-annual meeting in December, usually in the Ottawa-Gatineau area. I've gone to almost all those meetings. That's about 30-some meetings. They last sometimes for 3 or 4 days. I have never, ever heard of a prime minister coming and addressing one of those meetings. If they're lucky, sometimes they get a government official. They might get even occasionally a minister of Aboriginal Affairs, but not the prime minister. That's just not in the cards. So when Trudeau appeared on Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock to speak about what his new government was going to do, the fact that he was actually in the room was itself unprecedented. But that's not the most important thing. The most important thing is what he said. And what he said is this relationship between the Indigenous people and this country is broken. And it has to be dealt with. We have to overcome the break in this relationship, which goes back for a very long period of time, older than the country itself. And then he ticked off half a dozen things which the chiefs across the country have talked about for years. The problems with educational funding, the 2% cap, the miserable situation in so many remote, particularly First Nations communities in terms of housing, water, social services, transportation, resources. And said, we are going to do something significant and worthwhile on every one of those things, working with you. And we're even going to look at what happened over the last few years in terms of legislation that detrimentally affected Indigenous people across the country, and we're going to repeal all the legislation. I mean, I watched the reaction of the chiefs. I think they could not believe what they were hearing. And at one point, I think he realized that that was the case, so he turned actually to the national chief and he said, in case people think I'm not serious, you might want to consult my new Minister of Justice, which is the former regional chief from British Columbia, Jody Wilson-Raybould. And then he said, or you might talk to my new Minister of Fisheries and Oceans, Hunter Tutu, from Iqaluit. Or you might look at my Minister for Indigenous Affairs, Carolyn Bennett, from this city, who has been the liberal critic on Indigenous issues for the last 4 or 5 years. So it isn't just one person and one speech, it is an attempt to reframe this government to deal responsibly with all of the implications and aspects of the Truth and Reconciliation Report, the 94 recommendations, or take action items, and many other things. And I think the question that needs to be raised here today is, or maybe not today, but whenever there's an opportunity for more discussion, what does that say to this city that sits sort of at the center of so many of these things? We have an incredibly large and significant population of First Nations, Métis, and Indian people in the city. They're not always visible, and when they are visible, it's pretty troubling because it doesn't speak to both the full reality of the relationship and the potential that's there. So when I looked at the recommendations that were made for today's meetings, I realized there are 2 or 3 things there that seem to me to be reasonable places to start. There is, in particular, the issue around, I think it was, how many years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, Mike, that Toronto adopted a year of reconciliation.
2011.
Oh, so it's
14? I'm thinking about 2014.
So it's 1 year ago, a little bit more than a year ago. I remember at a distance watching it, and I can't repeat all the details there in it. But it was significant in the fact that it did happen, and that city did pass that motion. And other cities have previously done that, as you likely know, particularly places like Vancouver and Edmonton, that tied in with it a number of take action items with implications for their cities. And what is important now, I think, as a result of what the TRC has said in its recommendations, and what the Prime Minister has reinforced in his two major speeches in the last 10 days, is that the centerpiece of this is in fact the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. That's the new gold standard. That's the new framework in which so many things now are going to be looked at with, I would hope, a whole new set of eyes. Now, most people, you ask them what the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People are, they simply say, well, it's one of these, another one of these UN things, but you know, who knows what that's about. What people need to know is that took a number of years and several decades for Aboriginal leaders to bring to the fore, in the context of the international community, what the fundamental rights were that had been so badly abused for Indigenous people around the world. And what people in this country also need to know is that two of the people who led that process are Canadian chiefs. One of them was in fact one of the commissioners from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Willie Littlechild. Now, Chief Littlechild from Alberta still plays a very active role in chairing some of the meetings of the international body and in trying to steer out how do people live through that. And the other person is Chief Ed John from British Columbia, who at one point was actually a provincial cabinet minister some years ago. Now, Chief Ed John and Chief Willie Littlechild are two people who have already gained an international credibility in terms of giving guidance and leadership to the city. If I had any sort of specifics to say, I would think, as the Council tried to take a handle on the UN Declaration, two people no better suited to talk to this Council than Ed John and Willie Littlechild, because they are, so to speak, in the driver's seat. They have knowledge, they have experience, they have understanding, and I think they have the ability to assist major cities in this country respond to the call for action. So, in a sense, I see my role here today not so much to map out a series of detailed recommendations, but to say, if the City of Toronto is serious about layered reconciliation and following it up with making the gold standard the UN Declaration, then there's a lot of preparation work that needs to be done. And you can't do that overnight. It would take some weeks, months, not months. But I think in the interim, as a kind of show of commitment and leadership, there are several things in the calls for action list that was produced for the committee meeting today. And in particular, the one talking about some kind of visible monument. I believe there had been some discussion earlier about, and maybe it's already happened, with respect to Allen Park, and having some kind of, I don't know whether it's a double-barrel name or some identification that this might be seen as a kind of, one kind of place which would recognize the Indigenous reality of Toronto. And the other thing that is going to happen, I understand, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that the City of Toronto asked for and is now going to host the North American Indigenous Games in 2017. Am I correct in that? Is that still going to happen? I mean, depending on how that plays out, this is still a fairly new thing, the Indigenous Games. And for Toronto to host this could be really important in terms of raising the whole profile in an extremely helpful and positive way, and in also making use of other things going to happen in 2017, which of course is going to be the 150th anniversary of Canada itself. And so I see potential in that to be pretty significant. I'm assuming that there are a number of partners who are already ready, or maybe already engaged in trying to provide reality to that. If not, then that will become a fairly urgent task, I think. There are a number of other recommendations, and I don't really want to go into the details of them, but when you look at the 94 calls to action, you will see that there are some structural ones, and these are important, I believe, because they build in accountability I've been quite positive, almost euphoric about what the new government, the new Trudeau government, has announced it's going to do, and some of its actions it's already taken in calling for in instituting the inquiry on the missing and murdered Aboriginal women and girls. But I'm a realist too. I know that a government a year or two from now is going to have a lot of other things on its plate. And it's very easy for some of these things to slip off into the dark unless you have built in some accountability, some monitoring, some reporting. And there are specific take action items that are in the document which really build that in, and there's a place for accountability, not just at a federal level or even at a provincial level, but also at a municipal level, and that's where it becomes important for the city of Toronto. So I'm not going to go any longer, Mike, because I know you've got many other things to discuss this morning, but I would be quite willing and happy to help any follow-up comes from this, but I also think there are a number of other people who should be asked to take part, and in particular, I would talk about some of the Indigenous leadership that exists here in the city of Toronto and surrounding area. I mean, there are some outstanding people who I think would then make this have some real legs and have the capacity to transform a kind of verbal or written commitment to some reality for people in the city. So, thank you very much. I'll ask you want to have a discussion, I have a few questions about
Great, thank you. Are there any questions of the deputy?
Thank you. That was, the connection between being called for action and this committee. We need to establish that, and you're going to be helpful for us to do that. The whole monument thing. There is, I know there's a monument to the soldiers who died in the battlefield of the Tosh on Queen's Park there. So it's not, and I recognize that's a provincial initiative, but it's not lost that Toronto is a place of monuments. There's lots of them, and I'm really impressed with the Chinese one. You know the one, Mike?
The railroad.
Yeah, the railroad, the Ellen Garnet.
Yeah.
So there's some nice stuff there. I mean, I'm a little cautious about monuments because they seem to be an all and end all. Put the monument up and move on. So, so I'm cautious about that, but I hadn't heard that. I think that's an idea to be explored, maybe by a committee like this. But I'm more interested in how to translate these in behaviors here in the city that will lead towards what we would consider to be peaceful and balanced. And if that's called reconciliation, that's great. So I think this should be a document that we revisit and work with. Because immediate action to me doesn't come to mind so quickly, except for monuments and such. But I'm working on something more substantial in terms of how we actually create community together. So thank you. That, to me, that was helpful. And I think you should come back at some point. Maybe this specifically on the agenda as crafting recommendations or something, with some help.
To be honest, I've flipped through the recommendations on a couple of occasions, and it strikes me that there are many that the city can more easily take action on. There are some that are geared quite specifically to the federal government. And every time I read them, I think back on the last set of recommendations that were this long, and that was from the TARP report in 2011, and stuff that we haven't revisited since that time. And so I think it would be really interesting to kind of figure out how we can mesh the two documents together, and as we flesh out an action plan around truth and reconciliation, that we in fact insert what's missing from these recommendations, and in how we achieve.
There is a great simpatico between
Yeah.
this and TARP. I know, and having been involved with TARP, and in fact, it all goes back to RCAP too. So, which as we know, became a little dust covered. So this is here's a chance to actually do something. So what I'm saying is, can we make this a standing agenda on this committee? so that we hold ourselves to account. Because if you get off this horse and not talk about it, it slips away like all those other reports.
Well, I think it would be good too to have, and we're gonna have to map out, how do we, and maybe this is a decision that the committee can take in February. What structure do we wanna take, and how do we look through this and ensure we're achieving all of them? Because there are some that are very achievable, some that we're on our way to achieve, and there's, I think, ones that once you, doesn't mention municipalities, but once you tease into it a little bit, there is a role we can play. And how do we wanna develop our action plan? Do we do it in this formal committee, or do we set aside a small group of folks that are real keen on this and have them go recommendation by recommendation through with motions, and some staff to help develop those motions about how do we achieve these things, and how do we develop our action plan for it? Is it gonna be us asking staff to go out and produce that, or do we, in our networks, reach out and ask some of our colleagues, and networks about what do they want to see happen, or what action do they want to see the city take? Please, go ahead.
I just wanted to say thank you, and certainly the TRC calls to recommendations and articulating the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a framework for reconciliation and moving forward is integral, and as Justice Marie Sinclair said, it's not a quick fix. It's going to take some time, but I'd like to point to the number 43, which does state that we call upon federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal governments to fully adopt and implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a framework for reconciliation.
And I'll note in our notes, the city has adopted it. What we've actually done to achieve it is, I think, is something else altogether. Probably something that we can have staff come in and report on. And what have we done? What are we doing? And what could we be doing is, I think, a really key question to ask.
Because it's really about the relationship and moving forward.
Councilor Cressy?
Thanks, and thank you for the presentation. It's a real pleasure. I know we're not making formal motions today, and so this is more sort of food for thought in the lead up to the next meeting. I like the discussion around looking rec by rec all the way through what can we do at the municipal level. I just think, and this is building on some of the comments you made, that there is a real alignment, and I can see an motion being moved at our next meeting around 2017 and all the range of initiatives happening in 2017 that the city's already working on as well. So between the 150th celebrations that are being planned in this country, in this city, when you look at around the Indigenous Games that are going to be here, that here's an opportunity, whether we're looking at commemoration, whether we're looking at a cultural or museum component is one of the recs that was made. Here in the year 2017, with the city already doing work, already planning events with resources behind that, and the record, our own TRC recs speak to a number of components that should be woven into that. And so it seems to me that we will go rec by rec and look through what can the city be doing and should the city be doing. But I think we should plan towards at our next meeting having a motion ready to go, directing economic development and culture of the city, who are leading the work around Canada's 150th, to seriously look at some of these recommendations and how to include it, and the alignment alongside the Indigenous Games.
Maybe just a brief comment. I mentioned earlier Chief Wilton Littlechild, one of the commissioners, and also one of the people internationally who's helped bring the UN Declaration to life. Willie is also a very big athlete. In fact, he says, I think he spent 12 years in residential schools. He said the only thing that helped him survive was sports. And he's in his 70s, still playing competitive hockey. I told him he's a little crazy to do that. He broke his foot last winter doing that. But anyway, he was one of the people who was really keen on having the Indigenous Games get going. And I think it would be a great resource here in Toronto if we made use of all of the insights and skills and a number of others. But I do think that Council Cressy is right. There may be a synergy here between centennial celebrations, the fact that Indigenous Games are coming here, and that, as Trump knows well, there are so many spin-off positive things that can work for the longer term if they're built in advance. You just don't wait till it happens anticipate that this is going to lead to other things, and I think the time frame is pretty good too.
And as this is a bit of a casual conversation, does anyone have any contacts with the group hosting the Indigenous games? I say that because knowing that our next meeting is until February, that if we lose a 12th of the year of 2016 without having a discussion with whoever's involved with the city, who's ever involved with the organizing committee, just so that they understand there is support from political support for resources to be expended on becoming more actively engaged. It may be useful to pass that information along to May, and we can try to meet in January with some of with Mike Williams from the DEV, and in preparation, just to start putting the pieces together for a motion that could come to the next committee to more formally say we would like the city to become more involved.
Oh, I think in advance of that, we should reach out to economic development and culture around the sector's intentional plans, and I don't know how to pronounce that word. And to start looking at what they're thinking.
Yep. If we can do that and have something maybe in its infancy for the next meeting. Great. Councilor MacDonald.
Yes, thank you. I just don't want to get too close to David.
That's okay.
Maybe, I don't know what I've got, I have new eyes, but maybe they're messing up, I don't know. So I want to just add to this a little bit. As you know, Councillor Layton, and probably you don't know at the Canadian Federation, at FCM, Federation of Canadian Municipalities, sit on a committee that is looking at the implementation of urban issues related to Aboriginal and Indigenous people. And one of the things that we're looking at is the breaking out of all of those city initiatives that we should be proceeding with. We're also talking at the federal level with some of the leaders to reach out to see how we can be of help. But what I wanted to mention is that this kind of aligns with a whole lot of other things that are going on. So the big city mayors, for example, have taken on the role under Don Iveson from Edmonton of looking at all of those recommendations and making an action plan coming out of that. That's being supported and by our mayor, the mayor of Winnipeg, who is Métis, and the mayor of Vancouver and Montreal and Calgary. There are others involved in the big city mayors, but those are the main ones that are really working on it. I think, and I might be wrong, but I think that work is probably going to be close to ready when we come together in Winnipeg for our federation's meeting, the annual meeting. And we know that Jenny Gervais, the councillor from Winnipeg, who's on FCM and is one of the vice presidents, is very active in terms of making sure that that's a discussion as we move forward into the annual meeting. So I also, I'm not saying that by any means that we should wait for any of that. I don't believe that, but I think it will help us as we move forward to see what other cities, some great ideas that they may have, and the fact that these mayors are speaking together, if not sitting, I can think they're on phones, it really allows us a notion of bringing together the best of ideas. But it can't be done in isolation, I think, from our own communities and our own community leaders. So I think that as a piece of a body of work, it's really worth kind of bringing it here and putting it around this table and matching it up with some of the things that come out of here as well. So I just wanted you to know about that, because I think that sometimes it's very useful for everybody to be in the same boat and rowing. I would say one other thing, as I was listening to David and to talk about the UN Declaration. You know, I think that we've gone a very long way. When we were in Durban at the UN conference on discrimination and xenophobia or human rights issues, it was one of our leaders, Matthew Pinkham, who spoke on behalf of the Indigenous peoples of the world to that assembly. And I was a delegate at the time, so I was able to hear him deliver the message. He spoke very much about the declaration and where the world and the world states were behind in implementation. And I just wanted, as a reflection, because David has now talked about kind of the movement of federal government now to really work with the communities and make sure that we're moving forward on the recommendations and as a result of this huge discussion that has happened right across Canada with our people who have suffered through this and who have lived experiences of this. I wanted to say that Matthew was vilified in the Toronto Star for daring to speak against his government in such an international voice. And here was I, goofy me, feeling so proud that one of our leaders had been chosen to speak on behalf of the world's peoples. And I was very saddened by that. And I say it because sometimes I think it's important that we see that we've come quite a long way when David's kind of message comes forward and we realize that our own Prime Minister is not vilifying some of our leaders, but rather is saying we want to work with you. So I'm sorry to go on about that, but I just think that sometimes it's good to have that kind of reflection because it helps to bring together what everyone else is doing and making sure that we're doing it in as coordinated fashion as possible.
With that, if we've got a member of the gallery who wishes to speak.
I guess I'm Slabassi with TASK, just hoping to provide helpful information to the city and staff. The recommendation that we talked about in the TRC and the TARP, Ken is exactly right, there's simpatico there. There's 20 of our TARP recommendations that perfectly align with Truth and Reconciliation, so that work has already been done. So if it's helpful at all to the city, we have that information, so you can do twice the work with 20 of the recommendations.
I think you just joined our little ad hoc organizing committee. And we're happy to have you back. With that, should we move on to our next presentation? That's Councillor MacDonald on the poverty reduction strategy.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very